today, on April 1st, 2011, I will be interviewing Judge Marc Rasinsky. I guess we can start by you telling me where and when you were born.
I was born in Westminster, Maryland in 1948.
Okay. What was the religious demographic of your group of friends?
Religious demographic would have been, my closest friends were Catholic and Protestant.
What about at your school?
Same. It was probably more Protestant at school because at that time Westminster actually had a Catholic school that went grades 1 through 12. They still have St. John's then and St. John's now, but I don't think it goes beyond 8th or 9th grade at this point.
So you are Jewish. How many other Jewish families would you say were living in Westminster during your childhood?
2.
2 others? Being one of the only Jewish people, were you ever discriminated against?
I'm sure that I was in certain ways. The only overt discrimination that was practiced at that time was that if you were Jewish, you couldn't be a member of the private swim club that was in Westminster. Occasionally, there was more non-overt discrimination. They had school prayer back then. You were required to get up every morning, and in school somebody got up every morning and said a prayer, and it was a preordained prayer. And a lot of the prayers were from the New Testament. That obviously ended when school prayer went out, but that did exist, and there were it wasn't discrimination, but you would hear remarks, not necessarily directed at me or directed at anyone I knew, but anti-Semitic remarks, not knowing, you can't always identify someone as Jewish just by name or by sight. So you'd be in the vicinity when people would make anti-Semitic remarks.
How did the school prayer make you feel? Did it make you feel kind of like an outcast, or do you think you just, at least at the time, just thought of it as that's how it is?
Well, I think growing up, I certainly didn't want to be different from my friends. So it made me feel uncomfortable because I was different.
Yeah. Do you think that, how often or how much did you associate with those other Jewish families in Westminster?
I went to Sunday school for 10 years, so I would see these kids every Sunday for the school year for 10 years in a row. Outside of that, I didn't have any association with them.
Really? So you guys didn't...
They weren't my set of friends.
Kind of turn towards each other because of your similarities. What about the racial demographic of your group of friends?
That was pretty much non-existent. From the standpoint I had African American acquaintances, Westminster was a fairly segregated environment. I was in touch with other kids my age only because I was actually raised by a black woman predominantly to work for my parents, who both were working parents. They worked a lot of hours. There was a woman who was a maid. I also lived with an invalid grandmother, so she cooked the meals and cleaned the house and took care of me. And she had 11 kids, and she'd bring her son, who was my age, over. We'd play together. And then eventually, I guess I was probably 12 or 13, The Optimists ran a football league that they didn't care who you were. You could come out and play football. So I had some African American acquaintances at that point, but pretty much limited to, I'd see them at football practice.
Would you ever, like for example, the maid's son who you would play with, would you ever invite him to play with you and your other white friends? Or was it just kind of when she would bring him to your house?
It may have happened, but predominantly not.
Yeah. Do you think that? How do you think your white friends would have felt about your friendship with him?
My closest friends, I had 3 friends. I can't imagine that they would have viewed it any differently than I would have. One of them, in fact, as an adult, adopted an African American child, and I don't think his value system changed dramatically from when he was a kid. We grew up in a fairly liberal environment in terms of what we could do and what we could think and so forth. And my friends were more of, I guess, into thinking about serious things, such as race, religion, things of that nature, even at a young age. I think they may have not reacted any differently. It would have still been, for all of us, a different experience than just friendship. There would have been an awareness that that kid is different because he's got a different skin color. It would have been a consideration. He would still have been a friend, I would think.
What about your school? Was your school integrated, or?
Schools in Carroll County did not integrate at all until around 1960, and at that point it was very minimal integration. It was by choice, and I can only assume that the African American kids at that point weren't anxious to integrate. It would be scary for them, I think. Yeah. But when they closed the only African American school in the county, that's when the integration took place. And I can't tell you with certainty whether it was 1963 or 1964. I think it was one of those 2 years that Robert Moton closed. And then we had a lot of African American students in our classes.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about your father's business?
My father had a mom and pop pharmacy on Main Street. He had a soda fountain. He was a pharmacist, so he did prescriptions. He sold liquor, he sold candy, he sold cosmetics, sort of an all-purpose store.
Can you tell me about the racial climate at your father's business?
My father was not an activist in any sense of the word, but he also, I think, was genuinely tolerant of most anybody. And he certainly was just as happy to do business with someone who was an African American as not. To make much difference to him whether you were green, black, white, yellow.
So similar to how your feelings on the topic were?
At that time, I'd say yes. Although he did have, after he retired, he spent a lot of time with a friend of his who was an African American. They were both much older. They were both single. My mother died. I don't think the other fellow was ever married, and they traveled around on a daily basis.
Can you tell me about when the Freedom Riders came to town?
I would have say that that would have been pretty close to 1960, and I really remember two events. One, there was a parade right down the center of Main Street, and there were very few faces that I knew, very few. There was one fellow student of mine, classmate of mine, who actually marched in it, who was white. I did not, but I watched it. And I remember them coming to my father's store to protest. There were several drugstores on Main Street, and one of them, which was a prominent drugstore, had a lunch counter which would not serve you if you were African American. I suspect, without knowing, in retrospect, that they either did not know where you would be served and where you wouldn't be served, or they were just mistaken, but they went to, I think, all of the stores, restaurants, any place where you could get food, and tested the water, so to speak. And they came to my father's store, which greatly upset him, only for the reason that they came during his lunch hour, and they weren't buying lunch, so I don't think he cared that, you know, they had stood in the store and just talked, that would have been fine, but sitting at the few precious stools he had upset him greatly.
Do you know if there were any, acts directed the other way? For example, was anybody upset by businesses such as your father's that so openly welcomed the black residents of town?
I know of no incidences of that nature. A direct instances I do recall that when integration fully took place in Westminster, certain businesses either chose to close their doors rather than integrate or change the way they did business. So that was the response. Whether there were, I don't recall my father ever saying that anybody gave him a hard time about it.
So stores closing because of integration was really the most extreme anti-integration acts that occurred in Westminster?
There certainly could have been others that I was too young to be acquainted with them, but those are the most extreme measures that I could attest to.
Okay. What about when you left Westminster to go to college? Did you witness any racial discrimination there?
I'm certain that I did. I originally started college in Maine, in a small school up there, Liberal Arts College in Waterville, Maine, and African Americans were really a rarity. The town, Waterville, Maine, which probably had about 20,000 people at the time, I'm not sure they had any African American population at all. I mean, if I were to walk downtown with one of the kids that I knew that happened to be an African American, they would actually, they being the townspeople, often just stare. And it was a curiosity stare, I think, more than anything else. It just, this person's different. It's something I don't see every day, and so I really can't say there was that type of act of discrimination. Although there was the discrimination that I witnessed in Maine was really against, if any, group French Canadians.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you think that Westminster was better adjusted to black population than Maine, the area in Maine you were in?
I don't know if they were better adjusted, because obviously it was just a different situation. You know, there was an African American population in Westminster that had been around for longer than I had, for sure, and that was non-existent. And, it was probably akin to the Jewish population in Westminster when I was growing up.
What about the Jewish population where you were at college in Maine? Were there more Jewish people there than there were in Westminster?
Yeah, that was really the first time I really got to know any other Jewish kids, or any African American kids, really. I mean, it was sort of a melting pot. It was a liberal arts college with a liberal philosophy, and it was a good school, and quite a mixture of different students there.
Did you encounter people who had bad feelings towards Jews?
Not when I was in Maine, no, not at school.
So, as a judge, I'm not really sure how much information you're at liberty to give me, but how often do you see racially driven crimes today?
Racially driven crimes? Not a whole lot, to be honest.
No. So, like no hate, not many hate crimes, anything
No, not
like
a whole
that.
lot of overtly. It comes up every once in a while. It's nasty when it does, and sometimes it's racial. Sometimes it's religious.
Who seems to be the target groups of such crimes?
There's been a couple of cases that have come before me where Muslims were the target group. The most recent case was a woman who claimed she was targeted because she was Jewish.
So, your experience growing up in Westminster, everything from being the only Jewish family to being a person who was so accepting of black people in a time where not everybody necessarily was. How do you think that this may have affected your views in the courtroom with crimes like those that we were just talking about?
I'm sure I have a sensitivity to it. I mean, no question about it. But you know, every judge who sits on the bench carries his or her own baggage to that bench, and you confront it on a daily basis. Where you try to, I think most judges try to recognize it and try to push it out of any decisions that are being made. But how greatly we succeed, I can't be the judge of that. Somebody else will have to weigh in on that.
Well, those are all the questions I have for you. Do you have anything you'd like to ask me, or anything else that you would like to share?
The only thing I'd like to share is this perception I have of your generation, which is racial, gender, religious issues are obviously still around us, but I think there was a thought that was voiced back in Plessy versus Ferguson. So we're going way back in time, where that you can't legislate into existence or judicially force people to get along. and to accept people for who they are and ignore color of skin, gender, etc. That may indeed be true, logically. It seems to ring true. But I am convinced that regardless of what caused the initial change, whether it was Brown versus Board of Education when it came to racial relations in this country, or the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I guess it was, the fact of the matter is, I think there's been a marked improvement in race relations, a marked improvement in the tolerance of people based on gender preference, a marked improvement for women. And a lot of this was done either through legislation or through judicial decision that started the ball rolling, but ultimately I think it's been a great positive effect on society. When I see the exchanges that take place at McDaniel in the classrooms, it's like a lot of people often speaking with one voice, and I don't think that existed when I was in college. To the extent the wounds existed, they were way too fresh.
Yeah.
So that's my take on it.
Well, thank you so much for your observations and
very
stories.
welcome.
I think people will be very entertained by them and learn quite a bit.